Welcome to the Grow Strong Leaders podcast. I'm your host, Meredith Bell, and I interview business leaders who are committed to their own growth and the development of everyone on their team. If you enjoy my podcast, be sure to subscribe and rate it on your favorite podcast platform. When you hear the word authenticity, you might think of it as being your true self around other people. Actually, it's much more than that. My guest today has given a lot of thought to this word. In fact, she's written an entire book about it. She has a unique definition that I know you're going to find fascinating and useful. Her name is Erin Hatzikostas, and I want to welcome you to my show, Erin.
You nailed the name, Meredith. You didn't even ask me beforehand. I'm so impressed. You nailed it.
Well, I have to tell you, and this is a good tip for my listeners, you have the pronunciation of your name on your LinkedIn profile.
I do.
And I think that that is such a gift that people who do have unusual names to be able to record that so others can listen and hear. So
Yeah.
thank you.
That
Yes.
or Google. I also Google, sometimes if it's maybe it's a foreign name, it's a common name, but it's even
Yes.
first name. I hate to say it wrong. So it's amazing the power of Google. You can get little YouTube videos that tell you how to say it.
That's
And
exactly right.
yeah.
Well, I appreciate your having recorded that because that's tip number one for my listeners today. If you have an unusual first or last name, make sure you record that on LinkedIn so people who want to connect with you will know how to pronounce it.
Yeah.
And I want to also extend a big thank you to Bill McCormick because he's the one who introduced us and he's going to be a guest on my show shortly.
Awesome.
And so let me just tell my audience a little bit about you, Erin, before we jump into our conversation. Erin is a former corporate CEO who is recognized internationally as a leader on the impact of authenticity in the workplace. She's now CEO and founder of Be Authentic Inc. and the author of two books, one of which I have right here. It's called You Do You Ish, and the other one is called The 50% Rule. She's also the co-host of the podcast Because Work Doesn't Have to Suck. Erin posts regularly on LinkedIn, and her writing is both thought-provoking and fun to read. I encourage you to follow her and connect with her there. So, Erin, let's start with your journey in the corporate world and what it was that led to your passion about this topic of authenticity.
Yeah, I mean, so the beginning of my corporate career was a fail, which was interesting for a girl who graduated second in her class and always had done well at the rubrics and the grades. But I started actually as an actuary at Aetna. And what I like to tell people is I had, if you know the designations, the ASA and the FSA. In 3 years, I had my ASA and my FSA, but mine was attempted 7 actuarial exams, failed 7 actuarial exams. So it wasn't a great start, but I was lucky. I was at a large company at net, about 50,000 employees at the time. And so I bobbed and weaved my way through different roles, took on, jobs I was highly unqualified to do, leaned over the edge. And then eventually I joined a subsidiary company. Aetna had just acquired a company called Payflex in 2011. About 6 months later, I was recruited over there to just head up business development and strategy. But basically, I like to say is over the next year, every time one of the acquired company executives would leave, because that happens, right? They would sort of look around and be like, oh, okay, maybe we'll give it to Erin. And so I was promoted several times over the next couple of years and eventually was handed the coveted, Meredith, the coveted interim CEO spot. I'll never forget the phone call I got. I was COO at the time, and it's so classic. Like, I feel like I'm available all the time. But this one moment, we're down in Florida visiting my parents. They live north of Orlando in the winter. And not only am I on vacation, but I am minutes from walking out the door with my family to go to a water park. Right. And so I'm ready to just leave the phones, the ego, the everything behind and go whip down a bunch of water slides for 4 or 5 hours. And I get this phone call, and It's my boss at the time, and he basically was like, they're pulling me into a huge acquisition. They're naming you as CEO, but they're gonna go out and look for others, to make sure there isn't anyone better. Which is not a direct quote. That was my interpretation of whatever he told me in that moment, as my brain just was like, what, right? And here's one thing I learned. At first, I was mad. Not mad, but just sort of like, oh, they're not even gonna, they're not gonna just give it to me, and they think there's somebody better, and all that negative self-talk. And then I thought, you know what? I thought two things. One, I'm not sure I want the job. So while they're out there scouring, let me also test out and make sure I want to, potentially be the CEO of this company. It was a complex company. We had about 1,000 employees. We handled $2 billion in assets under management. Stuff broke all the time. The financials had been really flat. Really, the company was kind of in the pooper for the last 5 years. So on the surface, it sounded cool, but I was like, I don't know. And then the second thing I thought was, you know what? If I went through the traditional route and sat in interviews with my piece of paper resume in front of everybody, I would never get this job. And that's kind of like my mantra for everything. Like, if I just work harder, do things normal, A, I'm miserable, B, I'm not always going to be the best. But I thought, okay, while they're doing that, if my test really is the practical leading the business, like, bring it on. We've got some stuff we got to turn around with some things we need to do. So, long story short, 3 or 4 months later, it was like a no-brainer. They handed me the CEO position for real. And 3 years I led the company. So we went from 5 years of pretty much the same earnings, sitting around $17 million in bottom line. After 3 years, we were at 50 million. So we tripled the earnings. Employee engagement scores were up 15% from the time I took over. And here's the funny part, though. I kind of kept thinking, when am I going to be found out? Like, when is my luck going to run out? And it wasn't imposter syndrome. I had gotten over that years ago. I understood. I got the memo. Like, you got to lean into stuff you're super uncomfortable with, you're not qualified for, etc. But I literally, Meredith, would look, because this was back in the day, we would sit around a big brown table every month and every quarter doing monthly operating reviews, quarterly business reviews with my peers who were also running subsidiary businesses and companies. And I would watch them sacrifice so much more than I felt like I was sacrificing. And for me, because I had small children still, I was 42 when I became the CEO. But they would get on, I just got back from San Francisco, and then I'm going to LA next week, and then I'm going, and I'm having the steak dinners and meeting with customers. And I had a really good friend who moved her small family 3 times in 5 years to sort of take on different roles. I watched people give up their vacations and all these things. And so in my head, I thought, well, yeah, that's what you do. That's how you succeed as an executive. You work hard, you sacrifice other things. I have this thing called the compromise calculation, which essentially is when your career goes up, everything else goes down. And so I thought, well, I'm not really doing that. Like, I'm working hard, but I'm not sacrificing as much. And then people thought I was nuts, but I decided to retire. I went through a process. I was ready for something new. They were throwing a bunch of things at me, and I just yearned. 22 years in the corporate world, I knew that I thrived on exponential challenge. And the kids were still younger. And I thought, gosh, if I'm ever going to try my hand at something that's a little different, that's entrepreneurial, or maybe it's even running a small startup healthcare company, it's now. And so I technically retired because I was old enough, plus my years of service put me as a retiree, which gets you basically nothing, but technically I was a retiree. My equity didn't fall off a cliff. Um, and when I announced that, I just kept getting the same thing over and over and over again. We'll miss your authenticity. We'll miss your authentic leadership. This word authenticity. And it wasn't surprising to be called that, but it wasn't this sort of badge I had been running around with before. And after so many of those, I finally sort of had this epiphany that I wasn't getting lucky. I was actually just playing a different game than everybody else around me. And that game, it wasn't authenticity fluffy. It was tangible. It was getting me the best talent because word was out on the street in this big company that, like, whatever label you want to put, she's genuine, she's cool, she's whatever, like, go work for this company. Our culture had, really turned around as well. It helped me with executives. They trusted the heck out of me because I would sit in those QBRs And I wouldn't BS them. So many people would be like, everything's green, and here's a few yellows, and here's what, and I'd be like, we got a couple things that are red, and we're working. I would be very honest, or I would tell stories. I was always looking for something to connect because I had been on this authenticity journey for a long time. I just hadn't realized it. It got me better negotiations, which was a big part of our financial turnaround. Just the way I approached them. I didn't know what the hell I was doing, but I used my authenticity, which is about connection and trust, and it helped me. And so when I left, I actually not didn't do what I was doing now, but all of a sudden I would sit. I was actually working on another startup, and I would sit in the hockey rink. My son would be at practice, and I sit in those god awful cold metal bleachers with my laptop out, and it was just stuff was pouring out of me. So I was writing these like draft blogs in a Word document. And by the way, I was a math major, even though I failed my actuarial exams. I was not an English major. So I was like, where is this coming from? Why am I writing so much? And I thought, oh my gosh, I have a lot to say. And then one thing led to another. I started getting exposed and started having time to reflect. And once I realized, A, there was an industry in which I could pour this thought leadership out for a living, if you will, and B, that authenticity was this twofold thing. It was the thing that got me where I was career wise, and not only success, but doing it in a way where I could say yes and not be miserable because I, was trying to be in this mold of an executive. But it also was the same thing that got me business results, which nobody talks about. I mean, they'll say, "Oh, you got to be an authentic leader," but it's like 2 degrees of separation from it. But I was like 1 degree. I can show you 1 degree of separation between my authenticity and our business results. And so once I kind of put that together, I was like, "Oh my God, I have to go out. I have to go out and talk about this." And here I am, 6.5 years later, still talking about it.
And having a terrific impact. I think it would be great for you to talk about how you define authenticity. What are the elements of it? What's missing from the typical understanding or definition of it?
Yeah, so when I had this epiphany, I'm like, I got to go out and teach it. And then I was like, well, wait a minute, crap. Like, how do you teach authenticity? Because like everybody else, I was like, it's being yourself. I hadn't really thought about it. And then I was like, thinking, I'm like, but I didn't walk into work the same way I would walk into, a dinner party that you threw. It wasn't, I knew there was something more nuanced and started diving deep. And, essentially what I found is the root word is authentikos, which is a Greek word that means three things. It means to be genuine, but it also means to be original and authoritative. So it's like this mix and this juxtaposition. And so how I define it, I took that as permission to say, okay, we need to define it. I define it as exposing who you are when people least expect it in the service of others. And that I think is so important. And I know it is because when I do keynote talks and my workshops, that's where people are like, oh my gosh, like authenticity isn't a self-indulgent, do something for yourself. Because in the business world, it's like so easy actually to be inauthentic, right? Because you just wake up and you're like, here's the meeting agenda. I'll pull out the one from last week, or here's the sales presentation. I'll pull up the one from last month, or, it's easy to just copy that same formula. But when you do the work and you also have the guts to not try to just get things right and not pass the test and do the rubric and do things different so that what happens is you create this incredible connection and trust. People are yearning for something new and different. And when you're authentic, people actually listen. They lean in, they get intrigued, right? And it differentiates you, it differentiates your company. And so what I like to say is that authenticity is not about being, it's about doing. And it's about taking actions that are really focused on, not to be too pithy again, but like what I say is when you're focused on doing what's needed, not just what's normal. And that's like, to me, the most important thing is that people understand it's an action you take and it's an action you take for other people.
Yeah, that in service to others is so important. And also this idea of being original.
Hmm.
And you have your acronym HUMANS that is the framework you use to talk about it. And I want to explore just a few of those with you because we don't have time to do justice to all of them. I really want to encourage my listeners to get your book, You Do You Ish, because there's so much in there, and it's such a fun read. It really is a great combination of valuable content told with wonderful stories. I mean, you model, and of course, the M is one of your parts of your framework. But I want to start with the H in the humans framework, the humility, because I believe that's so essential for leaders. And I love the way you actually talk about humility and why it's so valuable. So, share a bit about what does humility mean to you? And then what does it look like in
Yeah.
action?
Well, first of all, it's not humble. Humble and humility are two different things. Being humble is sort of thinking less of yourself, if you will, or putting your sort of qualities down. Humility is about um, really recognizing and cataloging. This is really important because it's about the action, cataloging those times when you've been imperfect. It can be everything from, when I took my last drink of water before we got ready to record, I had like water dripping down my face. Like I'm always thinking about like it's the tiniest of things. Or it can be me failing my actuarial exams, or it could be slipping and falling in front of, your boss. Or so first of all, humility is about the stories where you're less than perfect. And it's about cataloging them and then purposely bringing them out of the attic and using them to create connection and trust. What do I mean by that? For example, when you're starting a team meeting, it's super easy, super lazy. I'm just going to call you out to start with the agenda and start. And this is what we used to do, right? And it's like, okay, fire drill number one. Then we're going to move to fire drill number two. And maybe if you're lucky, there's like a marketing initiative on there or something that isn't like a fire drill, but it's like proactive. But most of it's, right, firefighting, whatever's going on. If instead you say, you know what, I'm going to open up with, a story about something I fumbled on recently. And I would say if it has no context to the meeting, it's at least somewhere to start. But optimally, there's a point to it, right? Let's say that your team has been struggling to get projects done with quality, right? So maybe you start the story, you start the meeting with, talking about, helping your eighth grade son with his homework that he keeps messing up, but then how you were trying to help him and you actually, did the totally wrong thing and they were right, right? So because it's going to be about humility about you. And so you expose a place where you were like a bad parent, did something wrong, but then you make a point. Like, I tell you this because look, we're all not perfect. But if we, spend more time focusing on really understanding where we've had issues and da da da, right? Instead of just being like, we need to stop getting, having these projects go in with all the errors and blah, 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 blah. And so, to me, I always say humility is a fast pass to connection and trust, but you have to do the work. It's very purposeful. And that's the thing, get back to authenticity isn't easy. You actually have to do the work to pattern interrupt, to catalog those stories, and then purposely use them, in your town halls, in your introductions to new business clients, on your website. Like find those places to tell those humility moments, but tell them with purpose to create that opening for others to do the same.
Yeah, I think that's a key point. But also thinking consciously about where are those moments that maybe I've been reluctant to share with others in the past for fear of not looking like I have it all together. And what I loved about what you said is, that don't look at it like that. It's really a superpower
It's a
to,
superpower. And people
yeah.
love it. I do an intriguing intro exercise. I do it sometimes with keynotes if I have enough time. I definitely do with workshops, especially with sales teams, but leadership teams as well. I did it with a women's group back in January. And what we do is they write down a few humility moments, right? Like they sit there and then what I have them do is then write down a big brag. So the best combination isn't just humility. You sort of juxtapose it with like, and then like I did. I said I failed my actuarial exams, but then I said I crushed as CEO, tripled earnings, blah blah blah. Well, first of all, I don't say nobody wants to hear, but like if I just came on, I was like, I was a badass CEO. You should listen to me because I would like if I were you, I'd be like, I'd tune out. But if I start with a humility moment, one, you feel connected to me because you're like, oh, they're imperfect like me. But you're also kind of rooting for me. You're like, okay, hopefully, her life wasn't a complete disaster from there. And so I teach people to take the humility moment, combine it with the big brag, and then lastly tack on what I call a what's in it for them. And so we real time craft. They'll give me the pieces and I improv and show them how they can start this intriguing intro. And it's amazing, one, how much it bonds the group. First of all, they don't know that that's like actually primary, maybe secondary purpose, because when they share those humility moments in that setting, they then instantly become bonded. But also, they see how those fit together and how powerful it would be to come into a sales meeting and like say something like, hey, to know a little bit more about me, I want to tell you about the time I had the leader tell me this at the last keynote, that I was first in my job and we were raising funds for a big charity and I was in charge of the marketing and I transposed, two numbers and the toll-free number was actually to like a sex line or something like that, right? And so he's probably been mortified about that his entire career. But then when we put that with his big brag and then we say something like, and I tell you this because if you work with me, know that my attention to detail is always going to be there because I never want to, repeat da da da. And now it's like so much has happened. Instead of him saying like, oh, here's my background. Like I spent 10 years at a large, Fortune 50 doing this. And then I started my own company. And then people are like, whatever. Instead, you've done so much just in that intriguing intro, including the humility to create connection, build trust, because they're like, well, I don't think he's going to lie about anything else. He just freaking told me about his, sex, sex line, mishap. And I also view into who he is and why like attention to detail is so important and it feels genuine. And so there's just so many tangible ways. But again, it takes work, it takes practice to use it.
Mm. Just that's a great example. I was going to ask you for one where someone in sales or any new relationship where you want to build trust quickly. It I would just love all my listeners to think about how it feels to you when somebody starts with an interesting acknowledgement of a flaw or a bad experience, and then they can put it with something positive. I just think it makes someone so relatable.
Mhm.
And, they're like me, not perfect. They're not trying to prove. And I think also, Erin, don't you find that if somebody's coming across trying to impress with their credentials and everything up front, it creates more distrust initially because they're on guard about like, who is this person really?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say at maximum distrust, at minimum, people just don't pay attention because they're like, yeah, yeah, same formula, same Z. I'm out. Our attention spans are so short now that as soon as we recognize and say, oh, I know how this goes, then you tune out, right?
Mm.
We're doing this, and just to give an example, I mean, I do it for everything. Um, we're doing this with my speaker reel. I'm updating my speaker reel, and I've been working with my video producer last couple months, planning it out, and we're recording next week. But I know that most speaker royals, there's a formula that's sort of emerged, right? And it starts with the big stage and the booming voice and then the credentials. And I've also heard from event planners feedback like, we really just want to hear you speak. Like we love that stuff. It's nice, but like we need a clip that shows you can say, 5 sentences in a row without like stumbling. And so instead of simply just taking that feedback, which we're doing that where our clips are going to be longer. They're not going to be so like, oh, here's her one line here and her one line there. But we're actually starting the entire thing with me on stage with that big booming voice and the mystical view. And then I'm stopping him and saying, and I call him Ralph. And I'm like, Ralph, stop. No, let's just let him hear me speak first. And, I think this is kind of a segue to being unexpected, right? It, you guys, the game right now is attention. And if you don't do something different and unique, you're not going to get there. But I think I've just like hijacked everything, but I know we wanted to talk about expected too. But that's like an example of how I'm
Perfect. It's
sort
a
of applying
perfect
some of that.
segue because I mean, all the things that are in your framework are interrelated as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
So, this idea of sharing flaws and then being unexpected. Sharing a flaw up front is unexpected
Right.
by most people. You take this, and I loved this personally because I think I'm not un, I think I'm typical of people where I will sometimes gravitate to what is more familiar instead of saying, how could I really turn things around and grab their attention by saying something very unexpected and different? So, talk about what kinds of things you mean by unexpected and why is that tied to authentic? Because in some ways it feels like a disconnect.
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, remember Authenticos original is one of those. So it's sort of like a kissing cousin to that concept of being original. And it's also if you watch people, like I'll give you an example. Gino Auriemma, I don't know if you've heard of him. He is
Yeah.
the esteemed UConn women's basketball
Yeah.
coach, most wins in NCAA history. Love him or hate him, he is authentic as heck. And part of that is when he goes into a press conference, his responses aren't quite expected, right? There's a little bit
Hmm.
of an unexpectedness. And there's something, I mean, I think you can know this intuitively, but the research shows that there is something called a surprise sequence. And essentially, if we think there is a pattern that we already know, we tune out. And that's getting worse and worse every day, every year. But as soon as we get a surprise sequence or somebody does something unexpected, the effects of that linger because it's sort of a fight or flight thing. Once you surprise me and I'm like, oh, I didn't see that coming, Meredith. Now if you're talking to me for the next 10 minutes, I don't I want to protect against being surprised again, not necessarily in a bad way. I mean, there's part protection, it's part intrigue, like, oh, I don't know where she's going. And so being unexpected, especially at the beginning of your sales presentation, your website, your speaker reel, like it's almost like an annuity that keeps going because now people are like, don't know what they're going to do next. I think I'm going to tune in. But if they're like, oh, I know how this goes, they don't. And I just find when we look at people who are authentic, because they're always focused on what's needed, not what's normal, that inherently makes them unexpected because they're rewiring and redoing things in places where normal just doesn't work anymore. It just either it doesn't work because people know it, or maybe it's just not effective anymore to do things this way. It was effective at one time. Entrepreneurs that are listening, oh my gosh, this is like so true. Like, how many times have you gone to the latest guru or mastermind and they're like, here's how you do it, here's how you make the sale, here's how you write the website. And it's like, as soon as you finally get around to probably consuming that and doing it, it's probably not going to work. And that's why we'll talk about the 50% rule. That's where the 50% rule can help you because it doesn't mean you throw it all out, but you need to throw out half of it. Um, so yeah, I mean, I just think it's a key quality of authenticity is that it's always a little bit different. And the tough love I always give people, I'll say on stage, raise your hand if in the last week or so you've led a meeting and you've been frustrated because people, they're not fully paying attention. They're about to, and their, hands all go up. And I'm like, it's your fault. It's your fault. You're too expected. And so I think it's really incumbent upon us because I loved what you said. I want you said to the listeners, I want you to think about how you feel when somebody uses humility. It's the same test for all this stuff. How do you feel when you go to a meeting and it's the formula, like you tune out. You're not a bad person. It's just human nature. So those of us who are in charge of that meeting, are in charge of that website, in charge of that book, you have to be unexpected. That's why my first line is, I hate books. And it was sort of true. Like I hate most nonfiction books. But part of that was to be unexpected because I mean, then you're like, wait, this chick just wrote a book and she hates books. I have to read more.
Yes. Well, and the other thing I enjoyed about the piece of unexpected is incorporating humor in it because it's like that to me is a double whammy. It's not only you're doing something different, but if you're making people laugh, or at least smile, then that is, so, and I'll use one of your recent posts on LinkedIn as an example. You were talking about how you had been on stage with these other speakers and you had this hair.
Yeah, I was literally in the bathroom the next morning getting ready to fly out after spending 2 days. And I'm like, that is the longest hair I've ever seen come out of that mole. And the reception the evening before was on like this 360 rooftop and it was a sunny day in Fort Lauderdale. So being a blonde, like that is like a recipe for my hair sticking out because I'm like, it was sunny and it was probably glistening. Yeah. Yeah. But thanks for the story.
Well, and that to me was just a great example of, describing a flaw, if you
Mm,
will, and then just using humor and a totally unexpected opening. And yet it's all relatable. We've all had things where something personal about us, maybe our shirt wasn't tucked in, or, some weird thing, lipstick on your teeth, any number of things where you didn't realize it at the time. And later you're wondering, why didn't somebody tell me
yes,
about this? Um,
absolutely.
but you did so many different things in your role as CEO where you it was sort of applying that 50% rule as well as doing the unexpected. The conference you held
Mm.
where you were shown a clip that they wanted to play at the end of this guy dancing. Please tell that story because I think there's so many lessons from that, just in terms of being original and doing
Yeah.
something unexpected.
Yeah, so we spent about a year and a half investing in our leadership and culture, like big time. Like we spent over $300,000, and it kind of culminated with this leadership event. We brought in our 100 people leaders, so it was a big deal. And we had a consulting firm that was sort of coaching and consulting us, but we had pulled together most of the agenda. And I was to do the opening and the closing, no problem. And I had written I had written the bullets of the opening talk. I don't ever write out my talk, felt really good about that. But the closing, it's different, right? You kind of want to wait and see how things go. And I knew I wanted to curate. But they had sent me this video and picture this. It's Monday afternoon, about 4 o'clock. They had driven in for it. The event started that night. We had a dinner and we're all crammed into this office of my chief of staff next to my office. And so it's this small little office. There's 5 of us in there, 2 people from the leadership company, my chief of staff, my marketing event planner, and me. And they're kind of going through all the things. And they're like, "How about your closing?" I'm like, "Oh yeah, yeah, yeah." Like I've put in a few thoughts, but I'm going to write that more dynamically. And they said, "Well, what about the video? Remember we sent you a video?" And I was like, "Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Let's pull that up again." And so the video they sent it went viral. It's a video of they could call it the dancing man video. And this guy's at a concert and he's just sitting there and all of a sudden he gets up and he starts dancing. And then as soon as he starts dancing, everybody else starts dancing. But there's like this leadership overlay text. This was well before like TikTok and Reels. So this was on YouTube. It was like, kind of big deal that they put like a real thing with some leadership text or whatever. And so we pull it up and I was like, oh yeah, let's look at that again. And I stop at about, 8 seconds in. And I'm like, oh, okay, okay. I remember what I was thinking about this. I said, look, I gotta be honest, I love the video, but the reality is this guy's not a leader. He's drunk. And the other people who are dancing aren't following him. They're just drunk too. It's all a concert, right? On a hill. Nobody standing on a hill at a concert isn't intoxicated. I'm sorry, or most of them. Um, I said, but I love the lesson. What I'm going to do instead of showing the video, I'm going to be inspired by it. I'm going to start dancing and I'm going to try to create that same thing where I start dancing and everybody else starts dancing. And I look around the room and they're just all like looking at me and I'm like, okay. I said, well, are you worried about this because A, like the whole thing will go great and then I'll do this and like it'll ruin, the 2 days, or B, are you worried about me kind of making a fool of myself? And they're like, it's not the first one. And I'm like, oh, perfect then. I'm doing it. And I will tell you, Meredith. So I got up there I did the normal presentation. Here's the takeaways, whatever. Here's what I learned. And then they queued up the music. I had them queue up the music that I walked into my wedding for. So I had, I can do a mean running man to it. I already knew. And I started dancing. And I knew who was going to start dancing first. There was this woman at the front table. She just had great energy. She ran one of our like call center teams. And she was up in 2 seconds. And then other people were up. And sure enough, and then I went out into the crowd. And I think my favorite part was, no offense to the older men, but like a lot of them don't have rhythm, but they were still up and I was dancing next to them and they were like on the offbeat. And the whole room after this amazing 2.5 days was dancing together. And I remember, closing that out and then walking over to the leadership team, the company we were working with, and they're like, "Oh my God, that was that was the best ending we've ever had. And so, yeah, there's so many lessons. Like, I think for me, the biggest one, and I'd love to hear from you, is like this authenticity thing, like whether it's in your head or it's real, you're going to have a lot of doubts. Like, oh, am I going to look weird? Or people are going to think I'm weird or I'm different, right? Like I'm not fitting in. You got to fight through that stuff. Because as soon as you do it, like people are, most of the time are going to love it. And you're going to, most importantly, you're going to get the results. So if you're somebody listening and you're like, well, I'm the chief growth officer, but my CEO isn't, they're pretty stuffy and they like to do, it's like, just take a risk. They might think you're weird for a little bit, but as soon as you come with that, month or quarterly operating report and you're like, sales have gone up 20% or engagement, they're not going to care. So you really have to fight through, what you think are these, weird looks or really are the weird looks and just do it anyway.
Mhm. Well, it's interesting because as you were just talking, then another one of the stories from your book came up. And this to me is an example of unexpected. And then moving into this third area I wanted to cover around narration um, and and telling stories. And it was the one where you were getting some pushback. Um, I'm trying to remember. Oh, it was related to the HSAs, the
Oh,
health
that's a super
savings.
complicated one, but yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
and the argument in the meeting, you were making a presentation to your boss's boss,
Yep.
and the hypothesis or belief of people in the room was that only highly educated people could really grasp this. And so I just love the fact that you paused and instead of responding with statistics, you told a story. So tell us about that because it
Yeah,
was very powerful.
I told a story. I haven't told that one in a long time, but I remember, yeah, I was like, okay, I can either like lash back at the most powerful person in our company, the president of the enterprise, or I can tell them a story that sort of demonstrates no, there isn't necessarily a correlation between intelligence and understanding how a health savings account works. And so I told this story about one of our head actuaries and being in we were in like a leadership thing together and we were talking about HSAs. And I asked him, I said, Earl, that's not his name, but I said, Earl, like, do you use an HSA? Yes, we have one. I'm like, do you save up your money? Because that's what we're talking about. That, more intelligent people are better at saving the HSA instead of spending it, because that's a big thing you're always trying to tell people to do. And he's like, oh no, we just use the debit card every time. And then I said, contrary to that, I was in the car with my daughter a couple weeks ago, and she was asking me, like, what would you do if you had $1 million? What five things? And I told her, and then I asked her back, what five things would you do? And she was like 10. And she's like, and the fifth thing is I'd save money in case there's an unexpected medical emergency. She literally said that, which it's probably because she'd been in the car when I was on some calls or something. But, instead of saying they're wrong, I was like, here you have this head actuary who not only is a senior level person in the company, he deals with numbers, right? And he didn't really grasp that he probably shouldn't spend his HSA money. He should try to save it for retirement, et cetera. And meanwhile, you have a 10-year-old girl who mentions in her top five things if she had a genie wish for whatever $1 million that she would save it for unexpected medical emergencies. So yeah, that was just and then by the time I told that story, like got the correlation, but like they probably even forgot what we were arguing about. And I demonstrated sort of that I could connect with people and I could get people to think differently. And, there's just so many benefits that come when you have the guts to like take something and people don't even ask you for a story, but instead you turn it into a story.
Mhm. Yeah, and I know this personally. The stories that you hear, like in a podcast interview
Mm,
or in a speech, those stick with you and are actually the hooks that help you remember the concepts. The concepts are
absolutely.
typically more abstract. And so for people who are listening thinking, well, I don't know what stories I would tell, where could they start?
You've got to start with cataloging. So there's some people might think there's a chicken and egg. Like I have a situation, I have to find the right story for it, or I have stories, I have to find the right situation. I always lean towards the latter. If you are constantly either, write them down, or then as you go forward, you can write them down or just catalog them in your head. All you need are about 10 great stories. And you know what? six of those you probably already know because they're the things you're telling at happy hour to your friends or over turkey dinner or, some of them are on repeat. Like one of my favorite stories ever was about how my husband and I first kissed. Well, it's a hilarious story, but it didn't make it into the first book because there wasn't an application. But when I was writing the 50% rule and I was thinking about how do I demonstrate, that you can't throw out all advice. And then I was like, oh my God, what I did is I went back to what are some of the stories I didn't tell yet in either book. And I'm like, oh, now I see how I can make the metaphorical tie between our first kiss and its super humble moment that I went through and the lesson I'm making there. So it's really about having those stories because most stories have three or four prongs to them. There are three or four lessons you can go, multi directions that you can either literally, like that one was kind of literal, but also metaphorical, the one about, the actuary and my daughter. But sometimes there's just metaphorical, like, let's say you're out in your garden in the morning and you're just pulling weeds, like that alone, you're getting at the root. Like you could use that story in an upcoming thing. So really start to just be more aware of them, whether that's writing them down, cataloging them in your head, and then just when you have that situation, like I'm really good off the cuff now, but like let's say you have a sales meeting or something like that, and you're like, I'm trying to make a point. I would say write down the 10 stories that are your favorite, just like quickly, and then look through each one of them and be like, which one could I make a lesson out of this that attaches to that? And this is a big part. I do workshops all around humans. So we spend an hour on each letter. And for narration, the exercise, we start to create that story library and we start to practice. How do you find the prongs off of it? So it does take practice, but awareness is really the step that you need to start with.
Yeah, I think that's such a great idea because in the moment, it might not occur to you, but if you've taken the time in advance to start writing them down, and then I think the complement to that is to notice every day
Mhm.
what things happen that could become stories because they don't have to be these earth-shattering, life-changing kinds of moments. They can be the little things that you can extract the lessons from.
I'm yes, and I'm always doing it because here's what I want you guys to hear. Like, this is all about experimenting and practicing, but what will happen if you pick up what I'm putting down is you will start to get addicted to it because you'll have so many results. So that happened to me over years and years and years, right? And so as you get more and more addicted to people paying attention, people, smiling, sales happening, stories being more effective, you'll start to do it more and more. And so that's why I wanted to tell you, like, just experiment, experiment, experiment. And then you'll get to a place like you're right. Like I'm literally like my son's floor right now of his room, he's 14, is a total mess. And when I look at it, I literally just do a quick, I'm like, that's going to be a story sometime. And I put it in my catalog, which is my brain. And it sits way down in there. But it's something I'm like, first of all, I know so many people can relate with. Like, who hasn't had a teenager where you're like, what the heck is wrong with them? Right? It's the disgust, especially of boys, is so high. And I knew there's like gonna be a metaphor. There's gonna be a time I'm gonna break it out. So like I'm crazy. I'm always looking at those things and just putting a tiny little like mark on them, throwing them into my brain, and it just makes it really makes a difference. It'll make it that much easier to pull them back out in the future.
Well, I want to spend a few minutes at least on this 50% rule because here you've written a whole book about it. You mention it in this book, The You Do You-ish, but I know your book goes into it in much more detail. First, explain what is the 50% rule.
Yeah, and the 50% rule in the first book got remodeled and it's different in the second book. Spoiler alert. The 50% rule essentially says that anytime you're taking advice, doing something new, putting out a new product, working, getting mentor advice, only take about half of what's normal, what the advice is, what the normal playbook is. Throw out the other half, but then make room to bring in your own ideas. And this happened way back when to me when I was becoming an entrepreneur, I was overwhelmed. I sort of took that old 50%. So the old 50% rule in You Do You, which says time you're taking a new job, always be 50% uncomfortable. And I called it the 50% rule. what I did is I basically like it's like a picture frame in your attic that you never threw away and you're like dust it off and you're like, oh, now I know I'm gonna use it, for something different. But I started using it when I was overwhelmed as an entrepreneur, learning all the new things. It totally unlocked me. And then I would use it, I was using it selfishly on my own stuff here and there. But then every time for years, people would come to me and when they had a challenge or whatever, whether it's formal clients or friends, and I just kept going, well, why don't you 50% roll it? And it just kept like pouring out of me, like, didn't mean to. And they, of course, would like lean in and be like, what's that mean? And then I would explain it and they would feel unlocked. But that's not why I wrote the book. That was like, it was still super powerful. But then what happened, Meredith, is I started to see the rule everywhere. So the first time I remember this happening, I was sitting in Hamilton. I finally saw the Broadway play Hamilton a couple of years ago. And it was amazing. And I was like, oh my gosh, Lin-Manuel Miranda 50% ruled Broadway. That's why it's so successful. He did half normal, half new. And so then I started seeing, I watched a John Madden documentary and I was like, he 50% ruled broadcasting. That's why everybody knows his name, regardless if you're into sports or not. And nobody knows the rest of the names, right? I saw it with the Savannah Bananas, who have completely skyrocketed in their game of baseball. And they always were growing, but they really didn't skyrocket until they took about half of the rules of normal baseball and threw them out the window and created something called Banana Ball. And now their wait list is millions of people. They're selling out stadiums of 60,000 plus. I saw with Weird Al Yankovic. I'm like, he is the worst singer, but he 50% ruled music to do something new, and everybody loved it. And so what's great about the 50% rule is it's got such an element of motivation to it because there's actually science behind it. It's called the self-determination theory, which proved out that people are motivated way more by having autonomy than even money. Like we want to have some input. When we're just given the 10-point checklist, yeah, some people are better than others. They'll go through the discipline, but like it's not very fun. It's not very motivating. You have to just sort of stick with discipline. But as soon as you're like, half of this, I'm not starting from scratch, but half I'm gonna like free will it and put in my own ideas and test it out. It's so much more motivating. But back to the being unexpected, that also the reason I say it helps you go from unnoticed to unmatched is as soon as you change out about half the stuff. So, for example, Savannah Bananas, they still play baseball. People know what baseball is. That word is still in their business. But they now know that you do half of it not normal. You know how bored people have gotten of baseball? Just as bored as they've gotten of town halls and marketing, and value propositions that say you put the customer at the center of everything you do and you name it of the unexpected things in the business world. And so as soon as you just change about half of it, you start to gain attention, you start to get noticed. And guess what? It's a lot easier to have success than if you just try to work harder.
Mm. And, as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking how much more fun it
Mm.
is when you feel the freedom to only keep what you like and let go of the other part and give yourself permission to play with that different piece
And
that you
see how
want to
people
incorporate.
respond. Like last weekend, I'd mentioned the speaker reel. Last weekend, I spent between Saturday and Sunday 4 or 5 hours working on that because I've just been going through, like, there's a lot of back end work that happens first and going through clips and reorganizing and reviewing. I wish I had more to do. Like, I got done and sent it to Sean on Sunday, and I was like, oh, that stinks. Like, I wanted to do more. Now, if it were, some assignment where I had to do everything that was on a list, I would have probably never done it. But because I was excited and we're creating and the work I was doing wasn't even actually the 50% I was bringing in. So a lot of the work I was doing last weekend was on like the 50% normal work. It was like getting the right clips and but because I'm so excited about that project, because I know it's going to be a little unexpected, it's going to have that humor, it's going to be different, it's going to have Erin's stamp on it. Like I actually really enjoyed working on it on the weekend.
Now, you were talking about the motivation piece too, involved with the 50%, how we're more, or maybe I read it in the description of the book, but I was feeling that excitement from you in talking about that reel. And I was thinking about some of the projects I'm working on right now where I'm going to infuse that. And already I feel different about one of the projects. It's like, oh, how can I have, real fun with this? So I just want to thank you for your creative spirit, your different way of seeing things to create the unique definition of authenticity that I just love because of what you've incorporated into it, and especially that in service to others so that you aren't being a jerk or giving yourself permission to, just be whatever you feel like being in any given moment. It's so much more than that. And your 50% rule is an amazing idea. And it's caused me to start looking at things, like you say, you see it everywhere. So, with both of these books, it's this idea of giving ourselves permission to really bring our authentic selves to every situation. And so thank you for the work that you're doing, Erin. Thank you for writing these books. I,
You're
I highly
welcome.
recommend You Do You-ish, and I will be reading the 50% rule
50% rule is
soon.
my favorite too. That one's my baby. So I hope you'll check. I mean, I love them both, but
Oh, I
the
definitely am.
stories are abound in the 50% rule, and
Yeah.
it'll really get your wheels turning. So
Yes.
thank you
So
for
please
the
tell
support.
people how they can connect with you, get copies of your books, learn more about your work.
Yeah, I mean, so first, after you're done binging this podcast, we do have a podcast because work doesn't have to suck. So I always like to recognize that you must be a podcast listener. And we do half interviews, we do half normal, and we do half Nicole and I, my co-host and good friend, do real time sort of work situations of hers and lessons and also trite stuff. Our last episode was like the 10 products that we bought this year that changed our life. So it's a little bit of fun, it's a little bit of leadership, it's a little bit of career. And then you can find me sort of in sort of 3D-ish on LinkedIn. That's where I spend a lot of my time. I'm the only Erin Hatzikostas in the world, so if you can spell my name, you can find me. And that links out to my website and my books and all that kind of stuff. So should be able to find
Yes, we'll have those links on your show notes page too. And I highly recommend connecting with Erin and following her on
Thank you.
LinkedIn. I really have enjoyed your posts since I have started following you there. They're always really fun and thought provoking. So
Thank
thank you.
you.
Erin, thank you for who you are
Mhm.
and what you're doing in the world. The passion you're pursuing now, I think, is having such a great impact on the lives of people who start practicing the ideas that you so generously share in your books. And so thank you for being with me today. I appreciate you.
You're welcome. And I always say inspiration is a circular reference. So thank you for inspiring me to keep going and pumping me up to keep going on this fight. So, and thanks for having me here.
Thanks for tuning into my podcast. Now head over to growstrongleaders.com and check out the powerful tools we've created to help leaders strengthen their character and communication skills. Until next time, I'm Meredith Bell.